In 1842, Russian Emperor Nicholas I issued a decree prohibiting his subjects from trading black Africans. Violators were promised to be punished to the full extent of the law, on par with maritime pirates. You might wonder, what does Russia have to do with the unfortunate people of Africa? But the appearance of this strange document was easily explained. The fight against the slave trade was a fashionable trend of that time, and in St. Petersburg, they decided to show that they too were not to be underestimated. Meanwhile, while the Russian autocrat was addressing the issues of the destitute black population, millions of serfs in Russia itself lived in conditions that were hardly different from slavery. They were sold, traded for greyhound puppies, lost in card games, and peasant girls were turned into concubines. Unfortunately, serfdom in the Russian Empire existed for centuries and had a huge impact on the formation of the national mentality. In this episode, we will talk about how serf peasants lived in the Russian Empire, what their material conditions were like, and how dependent they were on their landowner. You will also learn about serf harems, the main slave markets of Russia, serf millionaires, and the most brutal Russian serf owners. My name is Semyon, and I declare the How They Lived section open. Let's begin. A bit of background on the issue. We should start the story with some background, because without understanding it, it's hard to grasp the essence and scale of a phenomenon like serfdom. First of all, it should be said that scholars still debate the date when serfdom emerged in Russia. There are two main opinions on this matter. According to one point of view, it appeared in 1592 after the law was passed that prohibited peasants from moving, or after the abolition of St. George's Day. By the way, this event shocked the people so much that the saying about St. George's Day has survived to this day. Other historians believe that the establishment of serfdom in Russia happened gradually, and it finally took shape later, around the middle of the 17th century. An important milestone in this process was the adoption of the Sobornoye Ulozhenie of 1649, which declared an unlimited period for searching for runaway peasants. Previously, a landowner could search for his peasant for 15 years, but now he gained the right to reclaim not only the runaway himself, but also his descendants, along with all the property they had acquired while free. In addition, this document even tied previously free peasants to the estate where the census of the 1620s found them. They were forbidden to change their place of residence. By the end of the 17th century, peasants were already being sold, given away for debts, and included as dowries. That's how the process began. The deprivation of serfs' civil and human rights, in fact turning them into personal slaves for their landlords. The situation of the peasants only got worse over time, because the authorities defended only the interests of the landowners. Serfs didn't even have the right to complain about their master's abuses. This was directly prohibited by the same Sobornoye Ulozhenie. Those who wrote petitions faced the whip and indefinite hard labor in Nerchinsk, or being sent to the army as conscripts. By the middle of the 18th century, a significant part of Russian society and the elite had a clear understanding of how harmful the serfdom of peasants was for the country. These feelings were further intensified by the Pugachev Rebellion, the largest anti-serfdom uprising in Russian history. Timid attempts to change at least something were met with resistance from the powerful landowner lobby, which even emperors were afraid to confront. For example, Paul I issued a decree on 3 days of freedom and generally tried to make life easier for the peasants. However, the emperor was soon killed by conspirators, so he didn't have time to change much. The decree itself was only advisory and was hardly ever enforced. Emperor Alexander I issued a decree on free farmers, which defined the legal status of peasants who were granted freedom. However, this did not solve the problem. According to the decree, only 1.3% of the total number of serfs received their freedom. Serfdom in Russia was abolished by Emperor Alexander II, who became known among the people as the Liberator. This historic event happened only in 1861. In other words, for more than 2 centuries, the majority of the Russian people lived in a situation that was almost no different from the slavery of black people in America. It can also be added that during this reform, the interests of the landowners were considered first, while the peasants were thought of last. Serf peasants, living conditions. It will hardly come as a surprise if I say that the life of a Russian serf peasant was truly difficult. There was little joy in it, but there was more than enough hardship and hard labor from dawn till dusk. The vast majority of peasants lived in ordinary 5-walled log huts. Besides the hut, a family usually had a barn for livestock, and only rarely could someone afford a bathhouse or a granary. Stone houses were extremely rare. We have found accounts from contemporaries who were struck by the poor appearance of peasant dwellings and the poverty of their way of life. As a rule, the peasant community helped the family build their house. The diet was extremely meager as well. Food was not bought elsewhere, because the serfs simply had no money. They ate only what they grew themselves. Meat, milk, butter, cottage cheese, fish. In short, foods rich in protein were a rare exception in the peasants' diet, and mostly appeared on the table only during holidays. Chronic undernourishment was considered a common occurrence in peasant families. The main dishes were cabbage soup, porridge, potatoes, and bread, to which they added tree bark, goosefoot, and acorns. An important supplement came from the wild: mushrooms, berries, and nuts. Peasant clothing was also homemade. There was no money for factory-made clothes. It was divided into everyday and festive clothing. Peasant families were large. Children were born almost every 2 or 3 years. However, child mortality was also extremely high. Almost every second child died in infancy. It was hardly possible to talk about a happy childhood in those times. Children as young as 5 or 6 years old were already helping their parents with household chores, and by the age of 10 they were working fully in the fields. Peasant duties. A serf peasant had to work a lot, because in addition to corvée labor, he also had to maintain his own household. Working 6 or even 7 days on corvée was the norm. And there was also the so-called monthly duty. It meant that the landowner would take peasants for his own work and personal household and then force them to work for a meager ration. The fate of such serfs was the harshest. It was no different from the fate of slaves in the New World. Instead of corvée labor, a serf could pay quitrent either in money or in kind, giving the landowner a portion of the harvested crop. However, corvée peasants were much more profitable for the landowners than those who paid quitrent. Therefore, wherever possible, landowners transferred their peasants to corvée labor. The key point is the landowner himself determined the amount of quitrent and the length of corvée labor. Serfs' leisure time. A serf hardly knew what leisure was. There was simply no time left for it. From early spring until late autumn, he was in the field, working hard for his landowner and for himself. The workday started early, and they went to bed at nightfall. The peasant had only one day off on Sunday, but even on that day he could be called to work. In winter, peasants had more free time since there was no agricultural work. That was also when they celebrated their favorite folk holidays, Christmas and Maslenitsa. They were accompanied by feasts and mass festivities. It should be noted that drunkenness was not widespread in rural Russia. The serfs had no time to drink and little money to spend on alcohol either. How serf peasants were sold. There were certain restrictions on the sale of serfs. For example, they could not be sold at markets or auctions. However, landowners easily got around these restrictions, and the authorities turned a blind eye to their tricks. There were entire fairs in the country that specialized in trading human beings. For example, in Nizhny Novgorod and Uryupinsk. Yes, it was very similar to the slave markets in the New World. Wholesale and retail sales, goods for every taste and budget. Labels on the serfs' foreheads indicating their price and skills. However, most often serfs were sold through advertisements in local newspapers. In some gazettes, you could find ads like, "A man with his wife for sale, a pleasant and hard-working couple, along with a pair of dairy cows." Emperor Alexander I banned placing such ads, but the ban was easily circumvented by writing "for rent" instead of "for sale." The cheapest were young village girls who needed to be married off. They were priced like calves, starting at 1.5 rubles per head. For a couple of peasants with children, you would have to pay from 30 to 50 rubles, but such families were usually sold together with the land. A serf with certain skills, for example, a shoemaker or a blacksmith, could cost up to 500 rubles. So-called house serf girls, young women who could serve the lady of the house, were highly valued, or well, to please the master. In general, beautiful young women were highly valued, and there was always a high demand for them. Serfs with any kind of artistic talent, actors, singers, musicians, were even more expensive. These were unique goods, for which people sometimes paid thousands of rubles, astronomical sums for that time. Some landowners even had real serf theaters. Only the wealthiest landowners could afford such things. The prices for serfs depended on the specific region and even the time of year. In winter, they were usually cheaper. Punishment for serfs. Physical punishments for serfs were commonplace. Essentially, the landowner could do whatever he wanted with his peasants. Only intentional murder was prohibited. However, even in this case, matters rarely went to court, since peasants were forbidden to complain about their landowners. The beating of peasants was even regulated by law. For example, according to the Code of Laws of 1832, a landowner had the right to give a serf no more than 40 lashes with rods or 15 blows with sticks. He could imprison him for 2 months, send him to penal companies for 6 months, or conscript him into the army. But these rules were not followed. On his own estate, the landowner was both king and god. That's why private torture chambers, flogging people half to death, setting dogs on them, or using serfs as targets for shooting practice were far from rare. Not to mention landlords raping their serfs, which was considered completely normal. There were also truly brutal cases. For example, the infamous Saltichika tortured several dozen serfs to death on her estate. The sadist was convicted and spent her final days in solitary confinement. The sentence was personally written by Catherine II. However, this case was more of an exception. The peasants complained about Saltichika many times, but the local officials always swept the matter under the rug. Only by chance did her case become known in St. Petersburg, and the Empress intervened. Most likely, Saltichika was mentally ill, but that didn't make things any easier for the peasants. And how many such Saltichikas went unpunished? For example, the landowner Stroisky from Penza, who tortured more than 200 people, died a natural death. In his estate, there was a real torture chamber in the basement, where his serfs were constantly sent. It should be noted, however, that it was mainly the household serfs, who lived in the landowners' estates, who suffered from the abuse. Serfs in the villages rarely ever saw their masters. It's not surprising that living like this, the peasants would sometimes snap and simply kill their tormentors. There were many such cases, from 1701 to 1769, and only in the Moscow province, serfs killed about 30 landowners, both men and women. The father of the famous writer Dostoevsky also died at the hands of his own peasants. He was cruel to his peasants and paid for it with his life. Serf oligarchs. Could a peasant from the serf class really rise in life? Such a prospect may seem like science fiction, but nevertheless, history knows of such cases. One of the most famous examples is Pyotr Eliseev, the founder of a well-known trading dynasty. However, it was a stroke of luck that helped him gain his freedom. Eliseev was a serf of Count Sheremetev and worked as a gardener for him. One Christmas, he treated the count and his guests to fresh strawberries. Sheremetev was so impressed that he promised to grant any wish of his gardener. After that, Pyotr asked for freedom for himself and his family. After becoming a free man, he moved to St. Petersburg, where he started his own business. After Pyotr's death, his sons continued the business. Sava Morozov was also a former serf. He became the founder of one of the wealthiest dynasties in the Russian Empire. He set up a small weaving workshop and then bought the freedom of himself and his sons from the landowner. One of the oldest confectionery companies in Russia, the Baba concern, was also founded by a former serf, Alexei Abrikosov. He bought his freedom from his female landowner, moved to Moscow, and started his own business. At first, it was a small family confectionery, which later turned into a factory. However, not everyone was so lucky with their landlords. The biography of the serf Nikolai Shipov is proof of this, and it resembles an exciting adventure novel. He was undoubtedly a talented entrepreneur, so after earning money by driving cattle, he offered his landlord to buy his own freedom. But not only did the landlord refuse, he also raised the rent to an astronomical amount. Shipov couldn't stand such treatment and ran away with his wife. Finding himself free but without money or documents, he demonstrated brilliant business skills by starting several enterprises from scratch. Shipov worked as a craftsman in Odessa and Romania and traded in Istanbul. He supplied goods to the Kalmyks. At the same time, his former landlord was spending huge amounts of money trying to find the fugitive. Shipov learns that peasants who have been held captive by the mountaineers are granted freedom. He goes to the Caucasus, ends up with the Abrik bandits, and miraculously escapes captivity. In this original way, he becomes a free man. Instead of an epilogue. In 1961, the serfs of the Russian Empire finally gained their freedom. This decision was not only overdue, but also extremely poorly thought out. The peasants were freed personally. They ceased to be living property. But the land remained with the landowners. In order to buy it back, the former serfs had to take a loan from the state, the repayment of which stretched over several generations. In essence, the peasant question was never really resolved. It became a real-time bomb planted under the foundation of the empire. In 1917, it exploded, burying both the country and the ruling dynasty. But that's a completely different story. That's all for now. See you next episode. Bye.